Welcome to the 7th episode of the School of Thought presented by HP and Global Tech Advocates. In today's episode, our panelists from the retail, manufacturing, and sport industries will discuss their transition from physical to virtual and the impact on IT infrastructure. And now, your moderator for the series, founder of Global Tech Advocates, Russ Shaw.
My name is Russ Shaw, and welcome to this webcast in the School of Thought, Managing Change in the Age of Hyperacceleration series from HP and Global Tech Advocates. I'm the founder of Global Tech Advocates, an international grassroots tech community representing networks of entrepreneurs, investors, experts, and tech leaders in more than 20 tech hubs and regions around the world. Global Tech Advocates has partnered with HP, one of the world's most respected and influential technology companies, to enable peer-to-peer learning across an international community of IT leaders. Over the past several months, Global Tech Advocates and HP have conducted a series of in-depth interviews with both large and mid-sized companies across multiple sectors and multiple geographies. And we've been speaking to CTOs, CIOs, and tech leaders, all on the front line of dramatic change and disruption caused by the global health pandemic. And the common theme that has emerged has been around the hyperacceleration of digital transformation. And as one global business told us, digital transformation that would usually take 5 years has been completed in 2 weeks. So throughout this webcast series, we want to share insights from IT leaders about this age of acceleration, looking at the trends that are affecting all of us and the sectors that are experiencing some of the most dramatic changes. Which brings us to this particular webcast, focusing on championing digital experiences in retail, sport, and manufacturing. Now, whether it's been around providing entertainment to people in isolation or delivering vital services to the vulnerable, digital channels and online services have allowed society to continue to operate at some degree of normality. The Guardian newspaper reported that the number of consumers doing a weekly online delivery shop doubled during COVID. In April, Netflix reported 16 million new subscribers since lockdowns were imposed around the world. And for sports, Sky has seen a 74% increase in audience size for Premier League, and the NFL has also seen record viewers during the pandemic. However, scaling digital services to handle such a dramatic increase in demand has placed considerable strain on the retail, manufacturing, and sports sectors. These industries have also had to radically reimagine the way that they operate using technology to minimize business disruption. This is digital transformation on a global scale with long-term consequences for some of the world's biggest industries. So, to discuss the experience of designing and implementing these changes and what they mean for the future of these sectors, we're joined by a group of leading experts. Catherine Tingle is the Technical Program Manager at Sainsbury's, the second largest supermarket chain in the UK. Previously, Catherine worked at Gartner and Deloitte before holding various digital and strategy positions at Sainsbury's, and she's also one of the company's diversity and inclusion champions. Stephen Nundy is an investment partner and chief technology officer at the European investment firm Lakestar. Stephen started his career at Goldman Sachs, and he now leads the Lakestar UK office, which has invested in some of the biggest European tech startups, such as Spotify, Revolut, and Opendoor. One company which Stephen advises is Globo, which is the fastest growing on-demand delivery player in Europe, Central America, and Africa. Steve Plunkett is the chief product officer at Sapona, a sports company at the forefront of virtual advertising. Now, Steve's been a technology consultant for the likes of JP Morgan, Mercedes-Benz, and PwC, and he was also chief architect at Motorola and chief technology officer at Ericsson. Now, before we ask the panel about the impact of COVID on these centers, I'd like to introduce Eileen Griffey from HP. Eileen is industry consultant for manufacturing, retail, and entertainment, and will also be our HP host for this webcast. So Eileen, welcome. And can you tell us what you've observed in the market around business adaptation or acceleration during the pandemic? And then specifically, what HP services have been most in demand, and what are some of the things that you're seeing and hearing from your customers?
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity. So yes, thank you very much. Even though this has been a very unsettling time over the last few months, to your point, Russ, digital transformation conversations that we've been having with clients for many years have been accelerated. And your example of the months or years off in the horizon to 2 weeks is a very good one. And definitely conversations now have moved to a digital first conversation. In the past, we might be speaking to them in terms of planning for something for digital technologies, but now, whether it's a manufacturer or a retail customer of ours, looking at things from a digital perspective and how the retailers can make sure that they're maintaining a good customer experience while they're trying to figure out how to adopt and incorporate click and pick into their environment or curbside pickup has been very important and a very big conversation for us. So first, there's the conversation about what we need to do to achieve some sort of a stable and steady state to support our customers. And then how do we grow and how do we look to consider and continue that the digital transformation while we're keeping our business in place. And the same thing from a manufacturing perspective. Automation has all of a sudden taken center stage in terms of digital transformation, and how do they get to a steady state or keep their feet on the ground and then grow their businesses moving forward. So some of the early technology requests that we saw were when everyone shut down, whether it was retail or manufacturing, and they had to move everybody home. How did they keep operations up and running and maintain a secure environment for those people and a safe environment? So most people think of HP in terms of printers and personal computers, and that was definitely the focus at the very beginning of this as we moved everybody, as our customers, and we moved everybody home. And then as we've moved forward and they're trying to figure out new ways to deliver customer experience and maintain a good customer experience and continue the growth in manufacturing, our augmented reality, virtual reality, 3D printing and manufacturing for replacement and for COVID efforts has been very important. And then also even our microfluidics and the pharmaceutical industry has become very important. And also digital packaging for supply chain. So we've been very fortunate to be able to help support and shore up the companies that are our customers, and then also help them figure out how to move forward.
That's great, Eileen. Thank you for that. And thank you for setting the scene and getting us started. So now I'd like to bring in our panel and kind of go through our first theme, which is around a sense of what everyday life has been like in the various organizations represented here. And Steve, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to come to Catherine and then Stephen. So Steve, sport completely shut down in March and is now returning with no physical audiences. What creative uses of technology are enabling you to continue your operations?
Hi, Russ. We, like many businesses, found ourselves with a workforce which could no longer visit their offices to do their jobs, but in our sports operations capacity, we were no longer going to those big sports stadiums where the production takes place. So for one half of our business, the software development piece, actually, things went on pretty much as before. People were writing software at home at their desks rather than in the office. So like many software businesses, we were able to proceed with minimal impact. But of course, the activity, the sports events were not on TV, so we had an operations team which was unable to do its job essentially, and we began having many conversations with the various sports entities that we work with, the broadcasters, the federations themselves. And from April to May, there was lots of discussions as to how can we get sport back on TV when traditionally there's a huge amount of activity at the venue. So there's a lot of technology. Much of it is brought to the venue for a game. You have these large outside broadcast trucks and vans and teams and maybe hundreds of people at a very big sports event and multiple broadcasters. So how could we do what we've done previously without all of those people and the tech? Because it wouldn't be easy to provide safe access to everybody. And of course, the focus was getting the athletes back on their playing surface, and the camera crews and the people who absolutely must be in place. But all those other roles, we'd like to try and do something differently. And as you said in the beginning, there was an activity called, or a trend towards something called remote production in sports broadcasting, which has been underway for 4 or 5 years. Some organizations are further along than others, but as an industry generally, we were midway through this transition. And suddenly we have to be able to do it, right now, and without having all of the time we would have expected to introduce it more gently. So from May on through to June, we started seeing some of those stadiums open up. There was a lot of experimentation, and essentially we had to modify our products to make them operate remotely. That meant, modifying the way that they interact with their operational teams, finding ways to provide very low latency, high resolution remote control access to equipment, having an absolute skeleton crew of people who could take equipment to a venue, but trying also to take nothing to the venue. So using connectivity instead of using vehicles to move signals around. So throughout all of our business, there was a great deal of experimentation over a period of weeks with all of our broadcast and sports parties and partners. And of course, it's been successful in getting the game back on the screen. We still don't have the fans in the stadiums, and there's been lots of interesting experimentation on that side. What can you do to improve the fan experience at home when you don't have the crowd and the atmosphere in the stadium? And so there's interesting things going on in that space too. But the main thing was getting sports back on screen, which we've managed to do through maybe jumping forward 3 to 5 years in time with remote production than we had anticipated.
That's great. Thanks for that. Very, very comprehensive scene setting in terms of what you've been dealing with. Very, very interesting. Catherine, online food deliveries, coping with the threat of food shortages, and then managing the distribution of products across the UK must have all posed very significant challenges in the last 6 months. So can you tell us how Sainsbury's has been using technology to overcome some of these obstacles?
Indeed. Thank you for this opportunity, first and foremost. And as you said, it did present significant challenges to Sainsbury's and to retailers in general. And one of the key mandates we had as a retailer, and especially the food arm of the business, was to continue feeding the nation during a pandemic, and also having to navigate new territory, new waters of panic buying, having our supply chain and logistics operation under undue pressure and unforeseen pressure, and leveraging our technology and digital capabilities where possible. Sainsbury's, we were able to harness our kind of omni-channel, multi-brand power through the fact that we have Argos in our arsenal. We also have Habitat, have Sainsbury's Bank, and also we have the largest loyalty program here in the UK. So that means that we are an incredibly data-rich retailer. And by harnessing all of that power, we were able to make really quick and accelerated decisions to open more facilities so that we could have more space for stock. And also it was around making sure that we had as many digital online food slots as possible, and essentially prioritizing our elderly, our disabled and vulnerable customers. Due to that kind of data-rich environment and that we have through Nectar and through various different means, we were actually able to leverage our own data capabilities by actually targeting those customers who were elderly, disabled, vulnerable, etc., before the government actually made some of that information available to us and to other retailers. So essentially, we were able to really use technology to switch certain things on and off. When we got the mandate from the government that actually non-essential shops on the high street are going to close, again, we were able to pivot our strategy by leveraging our existing kind of physical store estate through our Sainsbury's stores and have more click and collect locations within Sainsbury's as opposed to completely shutting up shop for Argos. So making sure that we're still able to provide that customer experience during a very uncertain and unsettling time for us all on a national level, but also a global level, which was incredibly important. So I think keeping the digital infrastructure really strong and really robust was at the heart of our program. And also, as you know, Russ, you already described in the introduction, we've seen an acceleration of kind of transformation programs within the retailer, and also I think we were on the front foot from the perspective of we were anticipating and we've been gearing up for a lot of change naturally through Brexit. Obviously, the pandemic is coloured a lot differently than Brexit, but there are some key considerations when it came to our especially our infrastructure and our supply chain, technology and logistics that we were already considering as a business, which essentially was sped up.
Wow, very, very interesting. And interesting to hear how you use the different brands and businesses in the Sainsbury portfolio, and also how data underpinned many of the things that you were doing. Very, very interesting. Stephen, I want to come to you. You work with a fast growth food delivery company. How has technology enabled them to continue operating and scale operations during the pandemic?
Hey, thanks, Ross. So yes, I'm an investor. We're an investor in Globo, which is a Barcelona-based final mile delivery company. They operate in 20 countries, 200 cities. And so you can imagine the vast amount of data that they have, not just on consumer behaviors under regular course of business, but also on traffic and delivery times across metropolitans, as well as restaurants and grocery stores and how they are performing and behaving under a regular course of business. And so as you can imagine, going through the pandemic, Globo was able to see city by city shut down, and how waves of consumer change, as well as restaurant output, was changing almost in real time. Now, this was, unprecedented. And so you can imagine the models that these organizations have built over a number of years now to create effective delivery and supply chains across the major cities, broke down during the pandemic, because those models were based off of historical data, and we've never had data or behaviors in the way that we saw during the early days of COVID. But certainly having a technology first operation like Globo's got, their ability to take in that data and modify their behaviors, be it where they position drivers, be it how they think about prioritizing deliveries. But one of the aspects that I think Globo was at the forefront of, which really came through during the pandemic, is the fact that they are a deliver anything application or a deliver anything platform. And so they didn't just have hot food on disposal to the population. It was also groceries, pharmaceuticals and other items as well. And so what they saw was their ability to accelerate the use of their dark supermarkets. Now, we've all heard of dark kitchens, but dark supermarkets isn't something that is normal right now. It's not something that has become that pervasive across Europe. But not only did they able to kind of stock their dark supermarkets with groceries that was in the most need for the regions that were being affected, but also to partner with other local supermarket chains and suddenly become the final mile logistics for companies that up till now had not really thought about a digital first offering or a delivery first offering. Click and collect is certainly an aspect that I think is in all of our lives. But during the pandemic, when government's asking people not to travel, not to move, last mile delivery becomes the lifeblood to many parts of the population. And so the ability for them to onboard, at great speed, other supermarket chains and micro hubs into their network really proved to be, a game changer in terms of how their business managed to shift and tilt, but ultimately, grow during these uncertain times.
It's great. Thanks, Stephen. Eileen, let me come back to you. What are the most common IT requirements for retail customers of HP, and how have they had to adapt?
So it's been really interesting to listen to what Catherine and Steve have said, because your conversation about keeping operations up and running, and then also enabling the collaboration so that you've got access to the data that is very important, whether it's through the loyalty programs or through your experiences. So to your point, keeping technology up and running and making sure that the services are supporting the requirements that they have has been key. And whether that's through, enabling people to work from home, as we mentioned earlier. The other piece that's really important to that is we're now talking about all of this data that's traveling back and forth, and that's key to keeping our operations up and running and giving us insight into our customers and where they need to be. And the last mile delivery, as Stephen was saying, is the cybersecurity piece of it. And so in addition to being able to provide the technology to keep things up and going, being able to make sure that all of that information is secure as you're doing that has been key to this conversation. And going forward, we continue to still hear about, and we will for some time, the technical community is very interested in figuring out ways to get into and grab your information. And so our job is to make sure that that information and that data is secure whether you're working from home or whether you're working in a distribution center.
Thank you. Let me move on to the next theme, which is around and having us think more about macro trends that you're all facing. And I'd like to ask you each about the long-term changes in the way customers are interacting with some of your sectors, sports, retail, manufacturing. So, Stephen, let me start with you. Do you think online food delivery is just going to become the norm as a result of the pandemic, or do you see us going back to some of our more traditional ways?
I think undoubtedly, Ross, we've seen an acceleration in adoption from many different demographics of society that maybe up till now have not embraced online delivery as the norm. Certainly, I think if you look at the older generation, they've had no choice but to start using some of the digital mediums that perhaps their children or grandchildren have been adopting and using for several years now. And I think with some really great user experiences that people are producing now, the ability for the older generation to really on board with online delivery, especially of food and groceries, has been accelerated. I think what is interesting, I think, is how that behavior is going to change. I think people traditionally have apart from buying an evening meal and an Indian or an Italian meal, people tend to stack when they buy food. I know certainly when I was a child, the big supermarket shop and then coming home and spending several hours, it always seemed like packing food away. Those days are seemingly gone, with people definitely moving to more snacking versus stacking. And I think certainly for the older generation, that is a much more palatable experience where they have someone come to their front door, leave the goods in a safe way, and then for them to be able to bring those goods into their kitchen and pack them away without needing perhaps your daughter or your son or any other family relation. People have seen how easy that is, and it's another outlet, I think, for both the grandchildren or the sons and daughters of older people, as well as people having their own independence. So certainly I think that trend is going to continue. We've not seen a retraction of work along those lines. I think the other aspect is whether people want to have food delivered as a pre-pack, or people want to be able to make their meals from scratch, or what other consumer behaviors may change out the back of the convenience of having food delivered fresh to your door. And certainly through the pandemic, what we've seen is differences in different cultures, even around Europe. For example, in Southern Europe, we've seen a much bigger propensity for people to want to be able to make food from scratch and ordering food so that actually the making of the meal is part of the community, is part of the social interaction happening within the household during the pandemic. Whereas when we've looked further east in Eastern Europe, we've certainly seen people taking a more propensity to actually having ready-made food arrive at the front door, because it's more about the eating and the socializing during the eating process rather than the manufacturing or the cooking of the food itself. So it's just been interesting to see those cultural differences and preferences coming through during this time. And I think, again, people are going to adapt their consumer offerings such that, people remain sticky and they grow their user base within these different sectors.
Great, thank you. Catherine, in what ways do you think that the changes from the past 6 months will change retail over the longer term? What are one or two of the big things that you're looking at that you're saying there's some big changes on the horizon?
I think for all retailers, it's given everybody a bit of a push to seriously consider the technology and digital side of their businesses, and actually keeping those functions now at the heart and forefront of all of their businesses. I think that the need for agility within retail business, especially traditional retail businesses. I mean, Sainsbury's is a 151-year-old retailer now. So the need to be innovative and agile so that, if anything were to happen again in the form of a pandemic or anything on that scale, which causes so much kind of friction in different channels and so much uncertainty, then teams are equipped with being able to switch things on, switch things off, and be able to make data-based, quick decisions for the betterment of customers. And I mean, customers are always going to be at the heart of all retailers. So I think, going to Stephen's point around even trying to make sure that we're providing a customer experience and personalized experience depending on even like region. So, whether you want more fresh options as opposed to ready-made options, I think they'll have that customization within like retail strategies as well, especially when you overlay the shift to sustainability and customers being a lot more concerned around the kind of decisions that they make and the impact of those decisions from a sustainability perspective and an environmental perspective. So thinking about how to reduce waste. And I think that, that big shop that we were just discussing, we have seen more incremental, smaller shops happening. And that is also linked to sustainability. So trying to reduce kind of that food waste of, things going off in the fridge, etc. So I think that harnessing that digital technology and data capability is always going to be at the heart of retailers for the next few years. And arguably you could say that it has been, but as we've already discussed, we see that retailers are now definitely taking it more seriously and making sure that they're on the front foot rather than the back, and trying to accelerate those kind of transformation programs and plans as much as possible.
Great, thank you. And you used the word agile. I think in every webcast we've been conducting through the School of Thought series, the term being agile has come up time and time again. So great to hear that it's a key focal point for the retail sector. Steve, I can imagine I think we're all relieved that sport is starting to return, but do you think that the way we consume sport has changed forever?
I don't think forever. I think the experience of watching sport on television is not just what's going on the field of play. The fans, the crowds that surround the event are a huge part of the spectacle. And I think what we'll see, depending on how feasible it is to bring that sort of large scale collection of people together in a stadium in the future, we'll see a combination of technology trying to safely allow certain numbers of people to come in quickly and safely into events. And we'll see a lot of experimentation in what we can do if that's not feasible. I think we've seen some of the beginnings of that. The very first games looked a little bit dry. The atmosphere was like watching a practice game, perhaps, even with the big stars playing in big games. And so we've seen sounds being piped in, taken from video games, for example, in some cases to recreate some of that atmosphere. And we'll probably see more of that. There's lots of things. What we do as a business is use augmented reality to replace physical objects in a sports stadium. The advertising, for example, so you have different advertising depending on where you're watching it on TV. Now, the same technology can be used to augment the seating area with fans, perhaps. And I think we'll see some attempts to try and use that sort of technology to bring something closer to what we're familiar with. But I think it needs to be involving the live audience. Now, if the live audience of the future is people sitting at home, then we need some way to bring those in at scale, so that you have that group atmosphere, whether it's piping audio from people at home or pictures, trying to recreate some of the fans. But I think really the focus of the sports industry today is how do we get the fans back in safely to some level, as opposed to how do we operate without them indefinitely in the future. The key part was getting the games back on TV. We've achieved that. And now we need to create something that's closer to what we all missed, essentially.
Great. And that's a really nice segue into the next topic that I want to cover with all of you. We've seen in all of your industries that the prevention of spreading and contracting COVID-19 for employees and customers is absolutely vital to the continued success of your businesses. So I really want to talk about how technology can create safe environments. So Steve, let me kind of pick up on this last thread that you mentioned. How is technology and the things that you're working on improving safety in sports during this environment?
Well, I think, as I mentioned on the opening question, the ability to get enough people into the stadium to make the event feasible, with a focus on particularly the players, the risk of contagion taking out an entire team or an entire sports federation isn't just the people on the pitch. It's those crews who are behind the cameras and everywhere else in the stadium. So we've seen the use of technology to allow us to have much fewer people on site, as I mentioned. That's not something which was easy, because there's very established ways of doing things in any industry, but in the sports industry particularly, there are lots of roles that are venue centric. The communication typically happens on local shortwave radio, so there's an awful lot of close proximity activity, which we've had to try and find a way to replace and yet recreate some of the best practices, because it's very difficult to reinvent how to do everything all at the same time as using an entirely new set of technology. So you're trying to balance bringing technology as an aid to recreate and simulate what we used to do in a physical location. So the safety aspect has really just been about, if our people are not traveling to venues around the world, they're not exposing themselves and their families and their colleagues to all of the risks that would go with that travel. They're not going to the stadiums in anything like the numbers they had before. They're not at risk of contracting and taking back. So protecting our staff and our businesses and those facilities and those stadiums has been a key goal. And really, it's all been about just having less people. That's been the only practical thing that we could try to aim for now. And that's pretty much what we've achieved.
Okay, great. Thank you. Catherine, let me get your perspective on how Sainsbury's is using technology to prevent the spread of COVID-19 and to ensure people's health and safety.
Sure. So the way that I think Sainsbury's has use technology to prevent the spreading of the disease is by switching on more online slots. So previously we scaled from 300,000 delivery slots to 700,000 in 1 week. So by helping, I know it's phenomenal.
How? Explain how that happened, because that is remarkable.
Yeah, a lot of late nights by various tech teams.
I bet.
So by being able to switch on more online slots, it keeps people more people at home, the public at home, and equally by protecting those key demographics of the elderly, the vulnerable, the disabled, by providing that kind of first hour shop dedicated to them, where they wanted to still shop physically due to their preferences. That's also a way that we were trying to protect those more, the more vulnerable sections of the public. Also a way that we have tried to, prevent the spread is by being really flexible in our ways of working. So where, having very strong leadership and strict instruction from leadership that if you are not kind of a key worker and you're not required to be in store or a physical location, work from home, and make working from home work for you and your family. So we saw a shift in our ways of working, being able to leverage technology through MS Teams and various other softwares to make sure that we were still working collaboratively. We were still having that FaceTime with our internal stakeholders to push the needle on those key decisions that needed to be made in order to ensure the safety not only of our customers but also of our staff.
Great, thank you. Stephen, can you tell us a bit about how Globo is using technology to ensure safe deliveries?
Yeah, sure. I think, it's not just about the deliveries, I must say. I think if you think about every aspect of getting a food or a bag of groceries from the merchant to ultimately the consumer at home, it's going to be about the restaurant, it's going to be about the micro warehouse or the dark supermarket, it's going to be about the driver or the person on the scooter or the person on the bicycle, and then ultimately at the final mile, at curbside, it's going to be how do you actually deliver that item to the front door? Is it a block of flats? Is it a communal block of flats? Does the person prefer for them to come to the front door, or would they rather leave it at the edge of the gate coming into the community or coming into the front garden? Again, these are all preferences that everyone has an individual perspective on. And certainly for that last aspect, Glovo was one of the first food delivery companies to basically open up preferences such that you as the consumer could indicate what you are most comfortable with. And I think that was, to us, kind of very important, that this is a very personal conversation when it comes to it. We don't understand ultimately exactly how to enter your building or how to get close to your front door, or whether you've got pets, or whether there's some other aspect that we need to consider when it comes to what you see as the right personal space around you, based on the guidelines of your city, of your country, or of you personally. And so Glovo certainly, very early on, kind of gave that flexibility to you as the consumer. But ultimately, as I said, it's also about the restaurants, and it's also about the delivery drivers as well. Understanding the full supply chain of who has been on what routes, who has been to what restaurants, which restaurants are you waiting at longer than others inside? Are you waiting in a secure environment that's COVID secure, as the term has been used here in the UK? And then to the extent that there has been an issue or someone has fallen ill, and at any point along that supply chain, essentially, how do we make sure that we've got the data so that Glovo can go back and speak to the driver, speak to the customer, or speak to the restaurant or dark supermarket that there may be an issue where people may need to isolate that have come into close contact with any of the people on that supply chain.
Great, thank you. Let me move on to the next theme, which is around employee engagement. And with the pressures of of navigating the last 6 months and the uncertainty about what the future holds, where there's a real challenge in maintaining employee well-being, providing assurances about job security, and ensuring values around diversity and inclusion are not forgotten. So Catherine, let me start with you. Sainsbury's and other supermarkets have been hiring during the pandemic and offering vital support to many people. Tell us about how the process has worked and what is Sainsbury's policy on recruitment during the pandemic?
So I'm actually recruiting at the moment, and the recruitment process is digital. So candidates will be interviewed digitally. We will not be encouraging, face-to-face interviews at this point. And then in terms of onboarding, especially during a pandemic where, they haven't, a new candidate or a newcomer to the business hasn't actually physically met their line manager, their team, their stakeholders. It's unprecedented in that sense. We have to kind of go over and beyond to make sure that they feel welcomed, they feel part of the team, they feel supported, they have the tools and they're equipped with the tools in order to make them thrive from day one within the team. So I think that in terms of kind of especially employee engagement, there are various different things that we've been doing. So encouraging walking meetings, making sure that all colleagues feel that they can have the reasonable adjustments required in order to work effectively from home, and being really open as well just around employee well-being, especially navigating a very difficult and uncertain time for a lot of people. And notwithstanding those with young families, but also potentially employees who are carers as well to older family members. So I think just generally, just being very empathetic to colleagues of varying different circumstances. And then again, when it comes to recruitment, again, leveraging all of those digital capabilities that we've spoken about today to try and provide a seamless interview experience for candidates.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. Very helpful. Stephen, how have you managed employee well-being for your team and your portfolio companies? Because obviously you're dealing with a lot of portfolio companies. Are you seeing increased levels of burnout, increasing stress levels? Give us a sense of how it's going from a well-being perspective.
Well, I think, if I take this in two halves, from an internal perspective, we are a venture capital fund. We're in 3 locations. We work remotely the majority of the time anyway. So, the transition into a fully remote team has not been that difficult. But certainly I'd say that as the months have gone by, fatigue has kicked in to some extent, and certainly the interactions become more and more transactional, and serendipity seems a long way away from where it used to be in terms of occurring during those normal face-to-face interactions. And so that is certainly hard, and we're certainly trying to find ways that we can reintroduce that serendipity as different countries and different cities open up. When it comes to our portfolio companies, we've got over 70 companies in our portfolio, and so the range of countries that those companies are in and the different stories in those different cities is quite remarkable. But I think the overarching advice is very similar to what has just been said, which is, we are encouraging our founders to be very empathetic towards their employees. I think if there's one thing in my career that I've understood is that you can never judge, never assume you understand how somebody else is thinking or how someone else is coping in any particular situation. Whether, perhaps historically you think, well, this person's got children, therefore they must be thinking X. Actually, you may be so far away from the truth, you have to ask them the question and wait to hear the answer and listen. And I think certainly that's where we've been helping our founders, is to not jump to a conclusion that being fully remote is the way to move forward. For the rest of the company's lifetime. I think there's been a few companies that have jumped and created some headlines by saying we're going to be remote first forever, we can get rid of offices. And you wouldn't believe the sort of anxiety that does generate within some people's kind of viewpoint, because They joined a company to be part of a thing, to be part of a culture, to be part of an office, to learn from people to the left and the right of them, and suddenly to be told that actually being remote first is the new kind of raison d'etre is actually creates a certain anxiety. So we've been really encouraging folks to take temperature checks, listen, make those adaptations where possible, but just to keep an open mind and don't jump to a conclusion to what the end state may be, because frankly, none of us know what the end state may be. And I'm sure it's going to be different to how it was before, but I'm not going to sit here and say that I think we're all going to go fully remote or that we're all going to go fully back in the office. And I think that really comes down to a culture question within the companies, and also in terms of what experiences founders and management teams are having with the different experiences they've got, because experiences really form and mold how we lead and how we impress that leadership style upon the rest of the organization. So I think we'll wait to see.
Okay, great. Steve, can I get you to jump in here and share your thoughts on employee well-being and some of the things that Sapona is doing?
Yes, indeed. And I think Catherine and Stephen have covered many of the points that I would have made, I guess. We're a business with offices in London, Helsinki and Barcelona. Each of those different locations have had a different experience of the pandemic, different governmental policy activities. I think, phase one, the opening month, was really about enablement. Can everybody have the right connectivity and securely access what they need to do their roles? And since then, it's become much more subtle. So, it's easier, I think, to sustain existing relationships, people who've worked in an office for some time. We're also in the midst of some recruitment, and we have some new starters due to come in soon. And that's going to be quite different for them and for their new colleagues, because we have to find ways of recreating some of that serendipity that's not so easy to achieve. And we've tried lots of things. We have, social activities set up on Zoom and on other communication tools, some successful, some not. And I think trying and finding what works for different people. I mean, I think the points that you both made, Catherine and Stephen, around everyone's experience and circumstances are different. So we've had some employees who find remote working to be a nirvana. It's fantastic. They've no commute. They can operate completely effectively at the keyboard writing code, for example. And so for those people, they don't want to go back to the office, perhaps. And then there were other people who just, they were in a shared apartment. They've got 2 or 3 other flatmates who are also trying to work from home. It's much less simple for them to operate now full time in that situation. So I think as leaders in the business and encouraging all colleagues, we were much more active now than we've ever been in terms of just asking how people are getting on. Just a quick comment on Slack or whatever tool you're using, making a call every so often just to check in on somebody, asking them what they did at the weekends rather than what's their current state of work type of thing. So I think the empathy side of what we do as managers and leaders has become much more prevalent, maybe even more so than when we were in the office together. And then finally, we've made adaptations to our office spaces. So we've put in glass screens between desks so we can still see each other, but have more safe zones, so that if people want to come back in the office, there's a place for them to come to. And again, depending on transport policy and local conditions, that may vary, but we want to make sure that there is choice and options for people to work in whatever fashion suits them. And we as a business then will try and make sure that people who are not in the office don't feel like maybe traditionally would have been second-class citizens in meetings. So we changed the way that we use technology to facilitate a situation where everybody can see everybody on a screen, even if some are at home and some are in the office. And that previously maybe wasn't the case, and people who work from home one day a week felt somewhat disconnected. So we've tried to get much better at dealing with that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Eileen, I'd love to bring you in and get your perspective on these points. How is HP ensuring the health and safety of its employees, and how do you manage diversity, inclusion, and well-being amidst the pandemic?
I'm very fortunate. This is an excellent time to be an employee at HP. I'll just put that out there. We had there was a deep respect for HP employees prior to the pandemic. That was part of the founding partners. But what we've seen over the last 6, 7, 8 months is that put into real focus as many people's lives have been disrupted. And so we have medical staff on board that, and being a global company, we've actually been able to learn from how things have been changing around the world. When China first shut down, we have operations in China, and when they started to open up. So we've been able to take best practices and learnings from around the world as things have changed and things have evolved. And throughout these many months of disruption and where people are learning a whole new way of working, let alone living, we've had weekly newsletters from our VP of HR. We have a homework network for people that are trying to keep homeschooling in place. We have financial webinars for people, or webcasts, for people to understand how they may need to cope during a pandemic. We've had cooking classes, back to Stephen's point, where some people got tired of ordering in prepared meals, and so they wanted to start ordering in or going out and doing pick and click and getting fresh food, learn how to cook. I've had family movie nights and sharing information, back to Steve's point about keeping in touch with people and listening, and really listening to our employees and understanding how things are going. But how was your staycation if you were able to take some time off? How things are going in your family. So, and even since we are not only have home office, we have manufacturing operations that have been brought back online, and those people are at a higher risk, and putting them up in hotels so that they didn't contaminate any of their family. We brought our intern program, back to what Catherine was saying, when in terms of onboarding, we brought our intern program in virtually. And so we've many different steps that we've taken to keep our employees' safety, and not just from a health perspective, but also from a well-being perspective in mind. So we've been very fortunate.
That's great. Thank you for that, Eileen. Let me move on to our last question, and I'd like to end with some brief, practical advice to the IT leaders who are listening and watching this webcast. So I'd like to ask each of you, what is that one piece of brief advice that you would give? So Steve, let me start with you. What advice would you give to companies that rely on physical events to operate?
I think it's breaking down the tasks and workflows that used to make up your day-to-day processes, and just trying to understand how you can move some of those things around. And technology is the key to achieving that. So, can you centralize staff who used to be at stadiums in a safe location? And as a byproduct of that, you probably find you gain efficiencies of scale. People not on the road so much, going between events. So, using connectivity and levels of monitoring to ensure not that people are doing what they should be doing, but that they are where you expect them to be, and they haven't encountered any transport issues or got into difficulties. So having technology as a way of communication and safely allowing your workforce to operate in a very different model than they have been familiar with.
That's great. Thank you. Catherine, what advice would you give to companies that rely on physical retail spaces?
So for companies that rely physically on those spaces, I would say that don't abandon and don't neglect the digital side and your digital presence, despite having physical locations. Being able to be omni-channel and having an omni kind of multi-presence, both digital and physical, can pay dividends when a pandemic happens, when a crisis or some kind of really big uncertain event happens. Being able to provide your customers with options is always a great thing to do, and you'll never be worse off for it in the climate that we're currently in. And whilst some retailers may be thinking about kind of that overhead of kind of property costs and keeping the lights on in some of those physical locations, like I said, there is benefit of, even if you scale down, there is benefit of having some kind of physical footprint for when things like COVID-19 comes through, but then also being able to invest in digital capabilities as well. So you've kind of got best of both worlds.
Very good. Thank you for that. And Stephen, what advice would you give to companies about scaling operations and customer acquisition during the uncertainty of the pandemic?
It's a great question, Ross. I think that, the companies that we've seen respond well are those that have really embraced analyzing their numbers in detail on a very regular basis. And so there's been an emerging role, I think, over the last few years of something called sales operations, which is not an often discussed topic, but those companies that really understand their sales funnel, really understand by channel what is the cost of acquiring a customer, what that customer is bringing to them in terms of revenues, and then adapting quickly when they see some channels not working as well as they were, and therefore reducing marketing spend and preserving cash, and just being prudent with spend are the ones that I see winning out. In terms of a trend that I'm also seeing, especially in B2B companies right now, sales cycles have elongated over the last 3 to 4 months as we've been in the pandemic. Large enterprises have not been focused on bringing new relationships on board. They've been preserving and working with existing partners such as HP and other large enterprises that they already deal with. And so companies should be very open, I think, to using the channel, i.e. using system integrators, the big four, and others out there who already have established relationships with large corporates and come in under that umbrella. Again, traditionally, maybe that's something that companies would look at later in their life cycle once they're more mature, but don't be surprised if these large consultancy companies who have these deep embedded relationships with corporates, they're very willing to engage with startups and help bring them in under their wing into companies and shorten that sales cycle.
That's great. Thanks for that, Stephen. And now, before we close the webcast, I'd like to bring back Eileen Griffey, who's been our HP host for this webcast, to share her perspectives about what she heard and to provide us with some concluding comments. So, Eileen, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you. This has been a great hour of information, and that's specifically it. The information and the technology that's required to keep your operations up and running, to build your operations, to bring fans back into sporting events, enabling and making sure that the technology is available and agile and ready to move as things change, as they have in the probably by week as things have been moving forward, and preparing for what's coming. So one of the comments that I've heard recently is that, let's make sure that we can help now and provide the technology that's required to keep things up and running and to satisfy the customers and provide, real-time sporting events and make deliveries appropriate based on what the client's requirements are, making sure that we have the technology to keep those operations up and running, can handle the data. And the underlying perspective of all of this is making sure that all of that's handled, even though it's not something that we've talked a lot about, in a secure fashion, because we're dealing with so much information has been very important. And I think one of the things that's really been very interesting is Tool One. Everyone has mentioned listening and the empathy that's now required of people in their roles, no matter where they are, whether they're the CEO of a company or the founding partner, or whether they're some of the frontline workers. And adapting your business based on what your customers or your employees are needing and what's required to keep your business up and going. I don't think if you had talked to us a year ago that maybe you would have heard empathy and listening as much in this conversation. So greatly appreciate the fact that you're looking to keep things up and running and making sure that your customers are satisfied and you're meeting their needs, but also understanding how you keep them safe, your employees safe, and how you work with them as their needs change or fatigue, as Stephen sets in from Zoom meetings, making sure that you understand that. So a very interesting conversation highlighted by something that probably a lot of people wouldn't have thought in terms of the empathy, but not only the technology. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Many thanks, Eileen, and thanks for those concluding comments. Really helpful and a great way to wrap up this webcast. So on behalf of HP and Global Tech Advocates, my thanks to all of the speakers, and my thanks to all of you who've watched this webcast as part of the School of Thought, Managing Change in the Age of Hyperacceleration series. Now, right after this portion of the webcast, there will be a follow-on Q&A session with the speakers, and the questions have been provided by the Global Tech Advocates community, so do stay on for that. And the conversation doesn't finish here. We will email everyone who's registered to watch this webcast and invite you to become part of our Global Tech Advocates and HP community. And we've also created a GTA and HP LinkedIn community as well. So you'll be invited to join that group as well. So my thanks to all of you. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the Q&A right after this session. Welcome back to the School of Thought, Managing Change in the Age of Hyperacceleration series from Global Tech Advocates and HP. And this particular focus on championing digital experiences in retail, sport, and manufacturing. So what I'd like to do is very quickly introduce some questions to each of our speakers that have come from the Global Tech Advocates community. So, Catherine, I'm going to start with you. What have you learned about the attitudes and behaviors of the public during the pandemic?
I think that we've all had a bit of a shock when it comes to some of the attitudes and behaviours of the public, whether that's, ranging from panic buying, the toilet paper, the pasta, the flour, being off the shelves for weeks and weeks and weeks, or whether it's in relation to humanitarian issues globally, and also diversity and inclusion as well. I think that there's been a whole myriad of opinions. Some I agree with, some I don't. So it has been quite shocking.
Right, thank you. Steve, do you think the pandemic will accelerate new technologies like virtual reality when it comes to watching sport?
Yeah, I think it'll force everybody to look at innovative ways of recreating what's been lost in stadiums. But I think, like we said before, getting some people back in the stadium is the priority. In the absence of doing that, or doing that at the scale that has historically been the case, I think we will see augmented reality, virtual reality, and other fan engagement models being tried out. And I'm sure their experience of watching live television sport events will evolve because of this.
That's great. Thank you. Stephen, as an investor, what new technologies are you looking at in the sports, retail, and manufacturing space for future investments?
Well, I think we've all been talking about machine learning and AI for a number of years now, and I've seen 2 investments that we've recently made where this is really kind of touched upon the areas that you've mentioned. One is in soccer. There's a company in the US that we've invested in called TraceUp, and they basically take football matches, kind of junior league, youth league, amateur stuff, and carve it up into match of the day style highlight edits, completely using machine learning. There isn't a human involved in the editing suite at all. And so that enables them to scale massively across a large set of matches, enables them to give video edits to youngsters who are perhaps trying to get a scholarship into university, so they've got a show reel. It gives parents and grandparents the ability to see their children playing soccer literally minutes, if not hours, after the match is concluded without having to travel vast distances. And I think that in and unto itself is going to change the way I think people do consume sport, certainly I think at the amateur level, where it does become more accessible for all. I think the second area I'd like to highlight is a company, again, here in the UK called StreetBees, that is really taking machine learning of what are you doing and basically extracting consumer behavior from that. So historically, consumer behavior, you get that through doing panels with some of the large companies out there that run certain panel events. But now, in a world where people like taking a photograph and engaging in a conversation with a bot, you can now start extracting real value of what is going on within your front room, whilst you're on holiday, what your consumer, how you're interacting with the consumer brand, and allowing the consumer brands, the large companies, to actually see that in a native way for the first time. So 2 highlighted companies there, but really this is where we're seeing machine learning and AI really having practical applications back to the consumer.
Great, thanks for that. And Eileen, the final question for you. What has HP learned in terms of what customers value from their vendors during the pandemic?
We talked about it a little bit earlier, but probably the biggest learning that's come from this is helping them now, making sure that their business is up and running and operational, and their customers are kept safe, and also they're able to meet all of their expectations. But then also helping them plan for the future. And that can be not just from the particular company's perspective, but also sharing best practices, what we're seeing with other companies in the industry, what we're seeing from a global perspective with our companies, our customers that are in the same industries. And so being able to provide that information for them and share those types of things. And interestingly enough, while they're trying to get their businesses up and running and kind of keep an eye on what they need to be planning for in the future, they're also keeping an eye on how their partners, like HP, are addressing the safety of our employees, the safety of their customers, and factoring the diversity and sustainability aspect that was mentioned a little bit earlier. So making sure that we help them now, but that we're also working with them for the future and providing information of what we're seeing and how things are going and how we can help them grow and adapt and be, as we were speaking about earlier, how we can make sure that they move to an agile environment and they're looking at continuing to invest in digital technologies. So help now and then plan for the future.
Great. Thanks for that, Eileen. And again, thanks to all of our speakers for joining this webcast in the School of Thought, Managing Change in the Age of Hyperacceleration series from Global Tech Advocates and HP. And I look forward to seeing you on a future webcast.
Thank you for watching. If you wish to continue the conversation as a part of the HP and Global Tech Advocates LinkedIn community, visit hp.com/HP School of Thought, as seen on screen, and click Join Now.